She looked me in the eye and said it like I was a stranger off the street. "You live here free. Hand over your savings or find somewhere else to go." My own son sat right there and said nothing. I nodded slowly, walked to my room, and made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. Welcome to Dad's True Revenge, where real family stories are told with honesty, dignity, and no apology. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments. And if this story speaks to something you have lived through, consider subscribing. You are going to want to stay for this one. My name is Gerald. I am 67 years old, retired, and for the past 14 months I had been living in the spare bedroom of my son's house. It was not how I imagined this chapter of my life. After my wife, Margaret, passed, the silence in my own home became something I could not carry alone anymore. My son David called one evening and said the words I needed to hear. "Dad, come stay with us. We have the room. We want you here." I believed him. I packed what mattered, handed over the keys to my old house to a letting agent, and arrived with 2 suitcases and a grateful heart. At that moment I thought family had caught me. I had no idea that the ground beneath me was already shifting. The first few months were manageable. David worked long hours, and I tried to make myself useful around the house. I cooked when I could, handled small repairs, kept my space tidy, and stayed out of the way. His wife, Renee, was polite in the beginning. Not warm, but polite. She had a way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes, and I noticed it early but chose to say nothing. I told myself it was an adjustment, a new dynamic. 3 people sharing a roof always requires patience, but small things began to accumulate the way they always do in a house where something is quietly wrong. A comment about the hot water, a remark about grocery costs, a sigh when I turned on the television in the evening. None of it was said loudly, none of it was said directly. It was the kind of discomfort that is delivered softly enough that you almost question whether you imagined it. I did not imagine it. David never said anything when Renee made those comments. That silence bothered me more than her words ever did. I had raised that boy to speak up, to stand for what was right, to protect the people he loved. And yet every time the temperature in the room shifted, he would find something urgent on his phone or suddenly remember a task in the garage. I started eating dinner earlier to avoid the tension at the table. I started timing my movements around the house to minimize overlap with Renee's schedule. I was shrinking myself inside a home I had been invited into, and somewhere in the back of my mind I knew that no man should have to shrink like that. Not at 67, not after everything. But I stayed quiet because David was my son, and I believed, perhaps foolishly, that loyalty to family meant absorbing discomfort without complaint. That belief was about to cost me something I could not get back. It was a Tuesday evening in November when it happened. David was home, which was unusual for that time of day. Renee came into the sitting room where I was reading, and she sat down across from me with the kind of deliberate calm that tells you a conversation has been rehearsed. She folded her hands, looked at me directly, and said it without hesitation. "Gerald, you've been living here free for over a year. That's not fair to us. We think it's time you contributed properly. We need you to hand over a significant portion of your savings to help with household costs, or we'll need you to find alternative arrangements." I did not speak immediately. I looked at my son. He was staring at the floor. She kept talking about expenses and fairness and contributions, but her words had already become background noise. All I could hear was the silence coming from my own son's direction. That silence told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in that house. I slept very little that night. I lay in that spare bedroom staring at the ceiling, running the conversation back through my mind, the way you do when something has genuinely shocked you. Not because I lacked the money. I had saved carefully my entire working life, and my finances were solid in ways neither David nor Renee fully understood. What kept me awake was the realization of what had actually been said to me. I had been given an ultimatum in my son's home by a woman who had known me for 11 years, and my son had sat 3 feet away and chosen silence. By 4 in the morning, something had settled inside me, not anger exactly, but clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives when you finally stop hoping a situation will improve on its own. I was not going to hand over my savings. I was not going to beg for my place in that house. I was going to do something far quieter and far more permanent, and I almost smiled thinking about it. I made my first call at 8 o'clock the next morning. I waited until David had left for work, and Renee had taken the children to school. Then I sat at the small desk in my bedroom, opened my notebook, and called a property agent named Susan, whose number I had kept from years ago when I helped a friend navigate a purchase. I told her I was looking to buy something modest, manageable, with a small garden if possible. She asked for my budget, and when I told her the figure, there was a brief pause on her line. "Gerald," she said carefully, "you have considerably more options than you may realize." I wrote down 3 addresses she recommended and booked viewings for that Thursday. Then I closed my notebook, made a cup of tea, and sat in the kitchen of my son's house with a quietness inside me that I had not felt in months. Nobody in that house knew what I had just set in motion. Nobody would know until it was already done. That is exactly how I wanted it. Thursday came, and I told Renee I was visiting an old friend for the day. She barely looked up from her phone. Susan met me at the first property at 10 in the morning, a neat semi-detached house in a quiet street about 4 miles away. The moment I stepped through the front door, something moved in my chest. It was modest, clean, and completely silent in the way that only your own space can be silent. The second property was too large. The third had a garden that reminded me of the home Margaret and I had shared for 31 years, a long, narrow stretch of lawn with an old apple tree at the far end. I stood in that garden for longer than was probably necessary. Susan waited patiently near the back door and said nothing, which I respected. By the time I drove back that evening, my decision was made. I had not told David, I had not told Renee, I had not told anyone. Some decisions are best made in private, especially when the people around you have already shown you who they are. I put in an offer the following morning, and it was accepted by Friday afternoon. I remember sitting in Susan's small office signing the preliminary paperwork and feeling something I had almost forgotten, the particular quiet confidence of a man acting on his own terms. The process moved faster than I expected because I was a cash buyer. No mortgage applications, no lengthy approval chains, just paperwork, patience, and a completion date set for 3 weeks from that Friday. I returned to David's house that evening and behaved exactly as I always had. I cooked a simple dinner, I watched the news, I said goodnight at the usual time. Renee made a comment over dinner about whether I had given her proposal any further thought. I told her I was still considering my options. That was not a lie. I simply did not tell her how far along those options already were. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing something nobody else in the room knows. I held that peace close and said nothing more. Over the following 2 weeks, I began quietly moving things. Not dramatically, nothing that would draw attention or questions. A box of books taken to my car on the pretense of donating them. Photographs wrapped carefully and placed in a bag I kept in the boot. Personal documents, financial records, the small items that carry memory more than value. Margaret's photograph in the silver frame was the first thing I packed. I was not being theatrical about it. I was simply being practical in the way that men of a certain age learn to be when they have lived long enough to know that clean exits require careful preparation. David noticed nothing. Renee noticed nothing. They were both absorbed in their own routines, their own conversations, their own world. A world in which I had apparently become a financial inconvenience rather than a father or a person. That observation did not break me. If anything, it made the packing easier. Each box I filled felt less like loss and more like something being returned to its rightful owner. Completion day arrived on a gray Friday morning, and I collected the keys from Susan just after 9. I drove to the new house alone, unlocked the front door, and stood in the hallway for a long moment without moving. The house smelled of fresh paint and empty rooms. I walked through slowly, the sitting room, the kitchen, the garden where the apple tree stood bare in the November cold. Then I sat on the floor of the sitting room with my back against the wall because there was no furniture yet and I did not mind. I had arranged a removal van for the following morning to collect the few larger items I had stored at my old letting agent's property. By Saturday evening, I would be fully moved in. I sent David a short message that afternoon. It said simply, "I have found alternative arrangements as discussed. I will collect my remaining belongings tomorrow morning. No need to be home." I turned my phone face down on the bare floor and listened to the silence of a house that was entirely, completely mine. David called within minutes of reading my message. I let it ring. He called again immediately after, and I let that one ring too. Then Renee called from her own number, which told me they were both standing in the same room reading my message together and panicking, in the particular way people panic when a situation they created has suddenly moved beyond their control. I did not feel satisfaction exactly. I felt something quieter than that. I turned the phone over when the calls stopped, saw 7 missed calls in the space of 12 minutes, and set it back down. That evening, David sent a long message. It said they had not meant for things to go this far, that Renee had been under financial stress, that he should have spoken up and he was sorry, that we needed to talk before I did anything permanent. I read it twice. Then I put the phone on charge, pulled my jacket tighter against the cold of the empty room, and closed my eyes. The time for talking had passed the moment he chose that floor over my eyes. Some apologies arrive too late to change the destination. They only change how you feel about the journey. I arrived at David's house the following morning at 9, with the removal van and 2 quiet young men who asked no questions and worked efficiently. Renee opened the door before I could knock. Her expression was something I had not seen on her before. Uncertain, slightly pale, stripped of the composed authority she usually carried. She asked if we could speak privately before I began. I told her politely but clearly that I preferred to keep things simple and that I would be finished within the hour. David appeared at the top of the stairs in yesterday's clothes, unshaved, looking like a man who had not slept. He said "Dad" in a voice that was smaller than any voice I had heard from him since he was a boy. I told him good morning and asked the 2 young men to start with the bedroom. I moved through that house with steady hands and a steady heart. Everything I owned fit into 11 boxes and a handful of bags. 40 years of a life, and it moves faster than you expect when you are finally ready to go. The removal was done in 50 minutes. I did a final check of the bedroom, the bathroom shelf, the small drawer in the kitchen where I had kept my reading glasses and a notepad. I found a photograph tucked at the back of that drawer. David at roughly 8 years old, sitting on my shoulders at a seaside somewhere, both of us laughing at something beyond the frame of the picture. I stood there holding it for a moment longer than I intended. Then I placed it carefully in my jacket pocket and closed the drawer. Renee was standing in the hallway when I came out. She said my name once, quietly. I looked at her and waited. She said she had not meant it the way it came out, that it was a difficult time, that she hoped I understood. I told her I understood perfectly, which was the truth. Then I thanked her for the 14 months, nodded to David, who was standing just behind her, and walked out of the front door with a kind of composure that takes a lifetime to build. The van pulled away. I did not look back. By Saturday evening, my furniture had arrived from storage, and the house had begun to feel real. A chair in the sitting room, Margaret's photograph on the mantelpiece, my books on the shelf in a rough order that I would refine over the coming weeks. I made a simple meal and ate it at my own table, in my own kitchen, under my own roof. The quiet was different from the quiet of David's spare bedroom. That quiet had been the quiet of someone holding their breath. This was the quiet of a man breathing normally again for the first time in over a year. I did not hear from David or Renee that day, which suited me. My neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Arthur, knocked that evening to introduce himself and welcome me to the street. We spoke briefly on the doorstep, and he mentioned that the previous owner had kept the apple tree in remarkable condition. I told him I intended to do the same. Small things matter when you are rebuilding. I slept well that night for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember. The first week in my new home, passed with a simplicity I had almost forgotten, was possible. I established small routines. Morning tea in the garden regardless of the cold. A walk before lunch. Reading in the evenings without the background tension of a house that did not fully welcome me. I did not contact David, and he did not contact me, and I will admit there was a grief in that silence, alongside the relief. He was still my son. That fact does not disappear because a relationship becomes damaged, but grief and regret are not the same as weakness, and I had learned the difference. On the 8th day, my phone rang and the name on the screen was not David. It was his number, but a younger voice answered when I picked up. My grandson Thomas, 11 years old, calling from his father's phone. He said, "Granddad, why don't you live here anymore?" And that question, asked in a child's direct and uncomplicated way, landed somewhere deep and unguarded inside me. I told him I had my own place now, and that he was welcome to visit any time. Then I sat down slowly and stared out at the garden for a very long time. Thomas's call stayed with me for days. There is something about the honesty of a child's question that cuts through every layer of adult reasoning and lands directly on the thing you have been carefully avoiding. I was not angry at the boy. I was grateful for him in a way I could not fully explain. He had asked the question neither David nor Renee had the courage to ask directly, not "Why did you leave?" but "Why aren't you here anymore?" Those are different questions with different weights. I arranged for Thomas to visit the following Saturday. I told him I would make the lamb stew he had always requested at family gatherings, and that we would walk to the park at the end of the road if the weather held. He said brilliant in that quick, enthusiastic way boys do when something genuinely pleases them, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for weeks. Whatever had broken between me and David, Thomas was innocent of all of it. I was not going to allow the failures of adults to cost a child his grandfather. That was a line I would not permit anyone to cross. including myself. Saturday arrived clear and cold, and Thomas came alone. David dropped him at the end of the street and did not come to the door, which I noted without comment. Thomas walked up the path with his hands in his pockets and looked at the house with the open appraisal that only children and honest adults allow themselves. He said it was smaller than their house, but that the garden was better. I told him he was absolutely right on both counts. We spent the morning making stew, which meant Thomas sat at the kitchen counter asking questions about every ingredient while I cooked and explained. He told me things about school, about his friends, about a television program he was following that I pretended to know more about than I did. He did not mention his parents, and I did not ask. After lunch, we walked to the park and sat on a bench near the pond, throwing the last of a bread loaf to an indifferent group of ducks. At one point, Thomas said quietly, without looking at me, "Dad's been in a bad mood." I said nothing, just nodded slowly. Some things do not require a response. Sometimes the most honest answer is simply being present. It was during Thomas's second visit the following weekend that I learned what had been happening inside that house since I left. Children absorb everything and understand more than adults credit them for. Thomas mentioned, in the same casual way he mentioned everything, that his mother and father had been arguing a great deal, that there had been discussions about money, that his mother had called someone about a loan and his father had not been happy about it. I listened without encouraging more than he naturally offered, but the picture that assembled itself from those small fragments was becoming clear. Renee's ultimatum to me had not been born purely from ambition or cruelty. It had been born from a financial situation inside that household that was considerably more precarious than either of them had ever revealed. They had needed my savings not to supplement comfort, but to cover a shortfall they had been concealing. And when I walked out with my finances intact and my dignity intact, the gap I left behind was not just emotional, it was structural. I sat with that knowledge quietly and said nothing to Thomas except that the ducks appeared to be hungry again. 17 days after I moved out, David called at a time he knew I would answer, Sunday morning, just after 9. I picked up on the third ring. His voice was measured at first, careful, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed an opening but is uncertain how far the script will carry him. He asked how I was settling in. I told him well. He asked about the house. I told him it suited me. Then the measured tone began to soften at the edges, and the real conversation started to surface. He said things had been difficult, that he and Renee were under significant pressure, that there were financial commitments they had underestimated, and that the situation was becoming unmanageable. He paused for a long moment and then said, "Dad, we need help. We made a mistake and we need help." I listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, I let the silence sit for a few seconds, the way a man does when he wants to be sure he has heard everything being said and everything being left unsaid. Then I told him I would think about it. That was all. I would think about it. I set the phone down and looked out at the apple tree standing quiet and patient in the winter garden. I did think about it. For 3 full days I thought about very little else. I thought about the 14 months I had spent shrinking myself in that spare bedroom. I thought about the Tuesday evening in November when Renee had sat across from me with her folded hands and her rehearsed words. I thought about David staring at the floor. I thought about Margaret, who had always been better than me at separating the action from the person, the mistake from the soul, the moment of failure from the whole arc of a life. She would not have told me what to do. She never operated that way. But she would have asked me one question, which is the question she always asked when I was wrestling with something difficult. "Gerald, what kind of man do you want to be when this is over?" I sat with that question for a long time. I was not without resources. I was not without capacity to help. But help given without accountability is not kindness. It is simply a different form of being taken for granted. Whatever I decided to do, I was going to do it on terms that reflected who I was, not who they had briefly mistaken me for. I called David back on the Wednesday evening. I told him I was willing to meet, but that I wanted to meet with both him and Renee together, at my home, on my terms. There was a brief silence on his end, and then he said they would come Friday evening. I spent the intervening days neither anxious nor rehearsing. I simply continued my routines: morning tea, the walk before lunch, the garden in the afternoon where the apple tree was beginning to show the very first suggestions of new growth along its bare branches. Small signs of life returning to something that had weathered a hard season. On Friday evening they arrived at 7. Renee was quieter than I had ever seen her. David looked like a man carrying something heavy that he had been carrying for some time. I made tea, set 3 cups on the table, and sat down across from them in my own sitting room, in my own home, with Margaret's photograph on the mantelpiece behind me. I did not rush into conversation. I poured the tea slowly and let the silence do its work. Silence, I have learned, is one of the most honest things a room can contain. Renee spoke first. I had not expected that, but I respected it. She said she owed me an apology that was long overdue, not for asking for help with finances, but for the way she had done it, for the ultimatum, for the tone, for reducing 14 months of my presence in their home to a transaction. Her voice held steady for most of it, but broke slightly toward the end, which I do not believe was performance. I have lived long enough to recognize the difference between rehearsed remorse and the real thing. David sat beside her, and when she finished, he added his own words, quieter, slower, more burdened with the particular shame that belongs specifically to a son who failed his father and knows it. He did not make excuses for the silence that had cost him so much. He simply said he was sorry and that he had been wrong. I listened to both of them completely. Then I set my cup down and told them two things. First, that I forgave them, because carrying unforgiveness at 67 is a weight no man needs. And second, that forgiveness and trust are entirely separate things, and one does not automatically restore the other. They both nodded. I believe they understood. We spoke for nearly 2 hours that evening. The real situation gradually came fully into the light. A failed business investment David had made 18 months earlier that he had concealed from me out of pride, mounting debt that had quietly overtaken their savings, and Renee's desperation to find a solution before everything collapsed publicly. None of that excused the ultimatum, but it explained a great deal about the fear that had been driving the behavior I had witnessed over those difficult months. Fear makes people act in ways that do not represent who they are at their best. I understood that. I had seen it before in my own life at moments I was not proud of. I told David I was prepared to offer a structured loan, a clearly documented, legally drawn agreement with a repayment schedule that treated both of us with dignity. Not a gift, not a handout, a loan between adults who respected each other enough to make it formal. Renee looked at the table when I said the word loan. David looked directly at me and said, "That's more than fair, Dad." It was the first time in a long while that he had sounded fully like himself. The loan agreement was drawn up by a solicitor the following week. Everything documented, signed, and witnessed the way that financial arrangements between family members should always be handled if they are to protect the relationship rather than erode it. Thomas came for his regular Saturday visit while the paperwork was being finalized, and he noticed immediately that the atmosphere between his grandfather and his parents had shifted. Children always notice. He did not ask questions this time. He simply seemed lighter, the way children become when the tension they have been absorbing without fully understanding it begins to lift. We made the stew again and walked to the park again and sat by the same pond with what remained of a loaf of bread, the same indifferent ducks, the same cold bench, but something was different in the quality of the afternoon, a small, careful warmth returning to something that had gone cold. I did not have any illusions about the road ahead. Damaged trust repairs slowly and incompletely, like a bone that heals strong but never quite returns to its original shape. But it does heal. That much I believed. Spring came to the garden in the way it always does, quietly, without announcement, as though it had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. The apple tree came into blossom in late April, and I stood at the kitchen window one morning, watching the white flowers open in the early light, and thought about everything that had led to this particular moment in this particular house. I thought about Margaret and what she would have made of all of it. I thought about David, who was honoring the repayment schedule without fail, and who called every Sunday now. Not out of obligation, but in the tentative way of a man rebuilding something he had carelessly damaged. I thought about Renee, who had brought Thomas to visit one Saturday unannounced and stayed for tea herself, sitting in my kitchen with a humility that had replaced the composed authority she once wore like armor. I thought about Thomas, who had asked me recently if I would teach him how to grow apples. I told him it would take patience and several years and more failure than success before the tree gave what you hoped for. He said that was fine. He said he wasn't in a hurry. I looked at that boy and I thought, yes, that is exactly the right answer. Some things are worth growing slowly. Some things are worth every season it takes. If Gerald's story touched something in you today, a memory, a moment, a person you trusted who let you down, then you already know why stories like this one matter. Leave a comment below and tell me honestly, what would you have done in his place? Would you have stayed silent or walked away? I read every single comment personally. If you are new here, welcome, subscribe and stay close, because every story on this channel is told with the same honesty, the same dignity, and the same belief that people who have lived long enough deserve to be heard. Gerald's journey is not unique. Millions of people carry versions of this story quietly and alone. This channel exists so they know they are not alone. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. That means more than you know.